One of the recurring leitmotifs in this peculiar political literature that has blossomed on the grave of John Kennedy is the reflection that in the past, before the year 1963, people were sweet and innocent and well-intentioned and trusting of their government, and that the death of JFK ushered in a new era of cynicism and bleakness and hopelessness. I'm here to tell you the exact opposite. People in 1963, and I mean people who had never been to college, people who dropped out of high school, I mean Black people who served in the military in World War II and were treated like garbage by a totally racist military system. I think people in 1963 were much more cynical. They were much more grimly and directly aware of what the dirty business of governing the United States of America was, how it worked, and what it meant domestically. And they knew how much blood got on people's hands and how much mud got on people's boots in terms of foreign policy internationally. Do you know a lot of veterans of the Korean War? Do you think what America did in the Korean War was more or less brutal than what the British did in Malaya? That's what it was called then. You might have heard of Malaysia today. Change of names, came with independence. Do you think what America did in the Korean War, how do you think it compared to the Mau Mau rebellion? How do you think it compared to rebellions the British had put down in North Africa? What the Americans did in the Philippines before it's now 100 years ago? Yeah, how really? How about U.S. Marine Corps intervention in Haiti? People were unbelievably cynical, and they were informed by a kind of realism about politics in the year 1963 that's utterly lacking in the world today. And this moment today, this is 2023, when I'm recording this, in many ways, books that were published in, say, 1998, they're still news. They're still what people are dealing with today. The political landscape today is dominated by shrill, brittle declarations of one's own moral superiority, left, right, and center. If you think I'm only complaining about liberals or leftists, I'm not. Have you guys looked at right-wing Twitter? Have you looked at right-wing Instagram, right-wing TikTok? It's the same game. It's the same bullshit in brief. I stand with blank. I stand against blank, a 15-second statement from people who don't know what it's like to take any risks in their lives, people who are not informed by the mud and blood experience of the Korean War, World War II, or anything else, or indeed the daily denigrating reality of police brutality, racism, violence, and just the utter corruption of the courts. So let me just ask a question. Several books here I could hold up relevant to this, but this one perhaps more than most. The Dark Side of Camelot by Seymour Hersh. John Kennedy had a close personal relationship with gangster Sam Giancana. People today are shocked. In 1963, people were not shocked. And again, I mean people. I mean people who didn't even finish high school, people who didn't go to college. A much smaller percentage of people had finished college back then. A much larger percentage of people had experience with military service. A much larger percentage of people had experience with corrupt labor unions, organized crime, the way in which corrupt labor unions and organized crime collaborated with the local senators and congressmen. I actually think, people, including like poor Black people, poor Hispanic people, not just university educated, wealthy white people, I think people in 1963 had much more realistic and insightful attitudes towards politics, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy, international politics. I think people in 1963 had a much better understanding of who Joseph Stalin was and what the face-off between the United States of America and the Russian Empire, what it meant and what it didn't mean, than people do today. I think people today in America, again, normal people, including high school dropout, people of all levels of education, all kinds of language. I think Americans today have no fucking idea who and what Vladimir Putin is, what the war with Russia is. I think they have absolutely no clue. And that's the current conflict with Russia. When I talk to Americans or I talk to Canadians about Joseph Stalin, about the reality of communism, of America's conflict with Russia, but woo, the current generation is out to lunch. I could say everyone under 40. I mean, I'm not talking about people over 80 years old here, but everyone 40 and under has no idea. When I talk to people my own age or younger, I'm in my 40s, about what happened in Vietnam and why, what happened in Cambodia and why, which again is this same period. If you didn't know, JFK is making the bed that America would sleep in for decades to come. Okay, so it's funny. It's a recurring leitmotif. You can tell me if there is a single book on the library shelf of JFK, Assassinology, that does not contain this trope, this literary and political trope that, oh, in the good old days. This one actually says he remembers in Dallas before 1963, people wouldn't lock their garage doors. People would leave the keys in their car and put the car in the garage and wouldn't even lock the door. That, people were so trusting. And if a police officer came up and told you something, you didn't even question that it was the truth. You didn't question the government. So bullshit. Okay? Everybody in Chicago knew the extent to which the mayor and the governor were in bed with the mob. Everybody. And just mention this. Detroit had a separate mob at that time. Later, they became one and the same mafia organization. Everyone in Detroit knew exactly what the connections between the government and the mob were. Shall I go on? I mean, in each of these places, there were several different. No. This idea that people were naive. Now, look, how does this make these books and understanding this period of history more or less, important today? There were many, many scenes of JFK's profligate corruption in this book, Dark Side of Camelot by Seymour Hersh. There are several different scenes involving suitcases full of money or briefcases full of money just being handed over, tens of thousands of dollars. And one scene I remember was a brown paper bag with there's many thousands of dollars in it. But in any case, bribe money just piling up. One of the scenes described, JFK receives a briefcase full of money, and he opens a closet door and throws it in, and there's a whole bunch of other briefcases full of money. This is the level of, and there's bribery about military contracts. There's bribery about all kinds of things going on. It's all kinds of corruption, sexual corruption, and other things too, which I can talk about or not in this video, frankly. People are shocked by this today. All right. And maybe for some of you watching this video, it's worthwhile to be shocked. Now, I mean, I could fish around and read out for you verbatim what exactly Seymour Hersh says in his conclusion here. It's in just the last couple pages. Seymour Hersh is a very stupid man who has written and published several very important books. There's a difference between being stupid and smart, and there's a difference between something being important or being trivial. Sometimes stupid people accomplish important things. And before I bought this book, I watched several different interviews with Seymour Hersh in which he more or less said that he considers himself a stupid person. He says he just sits there with his notepad and his tape recorder, and these wonderful people who are experts come in and give him interviews and tell him everything he needs to know, and he just writes it up. And he says he can't believe his good fortune that after all these years, he's built up this reputation where he just attracts, these wonderful, talented people who provide him with this perspective. At the conclusion of this book, there are about 2 sentences which state in the plainest language imaginable that in 5 years of researching the book, he has never seen any reason to question the Warren Commission's assertion that JFK was killed by a single lone nut assassin, magic bullet theory, et cetera, et cetera. For those that know that Lee Harvey Oswald single-handedly killed JFK. And in 5 years of research in the book, he's just found absolutely no reason to question this or think twice. And then he backs this up by saying that he also, likewise, sees no reason to question the official narrative about Jack Ruby and the death of Lee Harvey. That just nope, that's it. One crazy lone assassin after another. Nothing to see here. And I'm pulling this up repeatedly. You see what a long, in-depth, and detailed book this is. And as I've alluded to, it presents itself as an expose on the corruption of the Kennedy administration. It's a very important book written by a very stupid person. I do think it marks an epoch in JFK Assassinology. Woo! 1997. I feel old. Melissa, how old were you in 1997? So I think of this as a new book in the history of the understanding of JFK. 1997. Some of you weren't born yet, okay? But if you think about it, there was this long period of trying to make JFK into a hero, into a stainless champion. I mean, the single most laughable myth about JFK was that he was some peacenik, that he wanted peace with Vietnam and peace with China and peace with Russia, that he was a man of peace, and that allegedly the conspiracy to kill him was these evil men of war who were sharpening their knives to get rid of JFK so that they could pursue a larger war. And of course, this is laughable for many different reasons, but this includes mythology about JFK in relation to the Bay of Pigs incident. So we can give this book credit and say, okay, it marks the end of one era and the beginning of a new era. It marks the end of the era of kidding ourselves about JFK's moral purpose in the world, his position on a whole range of issues, I mean, foreign policy most flagrantly, who he was and what he represented, what he was trying to accomplish in relation to Cuba, Russia, China, Vietnam, what was really going on at that time. I mean, before this book came out, I mean, the single biggest voice in the game, the most influential voice, was probably Fletcher Prudy, right? And let's see, in what year does Howard Hunt die? I'm just going to Google this. So Howard Hunt dies in 2007. So that marks another kind of era, changing of the guard. Now, okay, I could talk for hours about Fletcher Prudy. Fascinating, highly entertaining character. Fletcher Prudy has the common human failing of regarding himself as the center of the universe. And he has this in common with Howard Hunt. What Fletcher Prudy knows is significant, and there are particular facts he was wrong about. It happens. You can't expect him to be inerrant. But it's peripheral. It's out on the edges. It's out on the cusp of what really matters to understand. He didn't see it that way. He's living through history. He's a guy who actually worked at the Pentagon. He's involved with planning and carrying out black ops and top secret stuff. He has all this inside information, for example, on the U-2 spy plane missions. And that seems really important to him. The Gary Powers U-2 spy plane mission. He's got all this stuff that fascinates him. But it's really peripheral. I'm not saying it's irrelevant or extraneous. I'm not saying it's of zero salience. You can understand what's going on politically at the time. But it is truly peripheral. So Fletcher Prudy kind of comes and goes. We really have a new era reevaluating what happened with the deathbed confession of Howard Hunt, Good luck finding that on the internet now. When I was a kid, when I was a kid, back in 2007 or something, I remember it being easy to find many years ago. But after his death, his son went on a sort of speaking tour, an interview tour, and made this recording available on the internet. And Howard Hunt, it's very understandable that he saw the role of the CIA as being much more central and much more important than it was. Because basically, the CIA and closely allied intelligence agencies, black ops agencies, and that was his whole life. That was his whole career. It's very natural. He sees himself as the center of the universe. He thinks this is what's most important. But I cannot emphasize enough the turn of phrase he uses in his deathbed confession. He says that he was a bench warmer in what happened in 1963 in November in the assassination. A bench warmer. He doesn't say he's the umpire. He doesn't say he's the pitcher. He doesn't say he went to bat. He doesn't say he's the shortstop. He says he's a bench warmer. And that means a lot of things. It may mean that he was prepared to step in and take over. He was prepared to help. He was part of a backup team or something. But it does also mean that he did nothing. Like he didn't actually do anything himself. So the significance of his confession, it's much more than zero. It does tell you something. It helps you understand. And the list of names he provided for who was involved, it's interesting. It's significant. Quite a series of organized crime figures have stepped forward and told their version of events. I believe I read the autobiography of Gianni Russo. Gianni Russo. That's the name I'm going to write. So this is Gianni with a G, not with a J. Gianni Russo, he gave a series of interviews, which are better written than the book. The quality of writing the book is about. I wish he'd had me as his co-writer or ghostwriter for that book. I could have written a much better book. But he gave some very lively, wonderful verbal interviews that include his recollections of and his very minor involvement in the assassination of JFK. The problem with the organized crime figures is that they regard themselves as the center of the universe. JFK did have connections to organized crime. What happened during JFK's presidency was, organized crime was involved. It's significant. Helps you understand what's happening post. However, I think it's very natural for gangsters to imagine that they played some pivotal role, they played some central role, and obviously these guys sit around trading gossip for decades. Again, it's been decades since these 3 books came out, but we are still very much dealing with the implications of that today. Okay, and the significance of organized crime is peripheral. It's not central. It doesn't really help you. It's great. If you want to study all the stuff you want to read, you learn more about the politics. You learn more about kind of the philosophy. Now, this is where it gets interesting. This is where it gets weird. I can't recommend reading this book because there's so much factually wrong with it. I think many people would say this book was a turning point. Forensic science. What exactly happened in the hospital to the corpse? What exactly do the x-rays prove or disprove? The carefully staged photographs, the human remains. Okay. Now, I can't call this peripheral. This book is 1998. It's a long time ago. We're still dealing with the implications. For one thing, when you really understand what happened with the hospital, when you understand the medical cover-up, this proves that the significance of organized crime must be very, very limited. There's no way Gianni Russo or the Chicago mob was working inside the military establishment and inside the medical establishment to carry out the hoaxes, or whatever you want to say, the falsification of evidence with the corpse. So there's some significance to that. And one of the greatest distorting sources of information of this book are some very passionate medical doctors who are interviewed or publishes letters from them, whether those are letters they wrote to the press. There's a controversy where they're writing to the American medical association. But there are these doctors who have studied the autopsy. Some of the doctors were there and saw JFK's corpse in person. They were still alive at the time of this book. And they're saying so passionately, no, 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 I'm certain about this. And this must be a fraud. This must be true. This must be false. And their passion and their certitude and the kind of our cultural esteem and respect for medical science makes this seem central, right? Is this central or is this peripheral? It's certainly of kind of unique significance, but ultimately understanding the medical cover-up afterwards is not going to be central. And then the strangest part of all, a little less than 50% of this book, but a significant part of this book is a very different kind of forensic analysis. What is the deal with the Zapruder film? To what extent, when we're looking at the filmed evidence of what happened, let's say the cinematic evidence, to what extent are we looking at a carefully constructed fraud? The answer is to a very great extent. Now, again, so this was 1998. I remember the state of the internet in 1998. Obviously, one of the ways in which the world has changed is now it's incredibly easy for any of you watching this video to go and watch a very high quality enhanced version of the Zapruder film and go through it frame by frame and see, in that sense, see the evidence speak for itself. And, you can read the analysis and what the evidence is proving that something is wrong with the film, something's been tampered with. And then you can go and look at it. You can measure it on your screen. You can check, oh, wow, it checks out. Okay. So that's a very gradual change that's going to go, as opposed to, the mainstream Hollywood film, JFK, that contained all kinds of wild claims, many of them false. One of my favorites is the claims that the shadows, there's a claim in that film, the shadows in the picture of, there's a black and white photograph of Oswald holding a rifle. And they claim that it's absolutely impossible for the shadows to be falling where they are in that photo. And of course, someone went out and stood at the same place at the same time of day, and they proved, no, the shadows can fall in that pattern. That's complete bullshit, But you couldn't do that while watching the movie, right? If you were in a theater watching that, a lot of people kind of absorb that mythology, absorb that information without being able to doubt it. And the other book we're talking about here, I have a shout out in the description of this video. You can click and go to the channel. Is called The Men on the Sixth Floor, and that is 2003. So I guess we're now celebrating the 20th anniversary of Glenn Sample and Mark Collum, The Men on the Sixth Floor. So here we are, 20 years after The Men on the Sixth Floor, and I don't know, let's round off and say about 20 years after each of these books. Looking ahead to the next century. What is the significance of the assassination of JFK? What can be known about it, and what will remain unknown? I'll say this about myself autobiographically. What bothered me most of all about the assassination of JFK was that it was so sloppy. And in the version of the world that Fletcher Prudy presented, and the version of the world that Howard Hunt presented, we were supposed to imagine it was this centrally organized operation carried out by professionals who had experience with doing exactly this kind of thing. And from the very first steps, looking at the assassination as such, and the cover-up that ensues afterwards, if you know anything about politics, you just can't talk yourself into believing it. It's so sloppy. It's so strange. There's so much wrong with it. There's so many things that are impossible to believe. I mean, one of the most flagrant, one of the most laughable, obviously, is the magic bullet theory. And by the way, this book, this is written by a direct witness, both a witness to the assassination and a witness to the Warren Commission hearings. He is personally responsible for why the lawyers at the Warren Commission very rapidly came up with the magic bullet theory. Long story short, he put his hand up and spoke in the meetings, and he said, "Look, there's evidence that one of the bullets missed, and the fragment from the bullet actually hit him in the face. So that was an established fact that one of the bullets went stray and hit the sidewalk. And there's no reason to assume there were only 3 bullets. But Warren Commission was committed to arguing that there were only 3 bullets. So they suddenly threw away all their diagrams and came up with new diagrams with only 2 bullets striking Kennedy and Connolly. And that is the genesis, a very hasty genesis of the magic bullet theory. Before that, they'd come up with a more plausible theory that there were 3 bullets, all fired from above, from the 6th floor of the school book depository. So anyway, that's his personal involvement in history, and there are many kind of personal touches in this book that are interesting and enjoyable to hear. But yes, okay. Nothing about this resembles a professional KGB assassination from the same period. Nothing about it looks like a CIA operation. When I was much, much younger, I don't know how many decades younger, I can remember saying to my girlfriend at the time that it seems to me possible that the reason why it was so sloppy was that these guys within the CIA were like dragging their feet and didn't want to do it. Like they wanted there to be this cloud of evidence of what, like, you know, what did, like, they wanted to get caught, they didn't want it to work or something. Like, how is it possible for this whole operation to be so flagrantly inept if you have this kind of Fletcher Prudy view of the world, E. Howard Hunt view of the world, that it's these, you know, James Bond-like Central Intelligence Agency figures who carried this out as a carefully planned operation. And by the way, sorry, a great contrast here is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., actually. Anyway, which I've made videos talking about in the past. Okay, well, when you add it all up, where we're at in 2023, instead, the preponderance of evidence and the Occam's razor explanation for what really happened in Dealey Plaza in 1963 is that it was just a team of goons put together by LBJ's right-hand man, Mac Wallace, that the actual heavy lifting, the actual knuckle dragging, the actual pulling of triggers was done by amateurs. And then you have professionals in the military, in the CIA, but above all else in the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, rushing around involved in this elaborate cover-up that ensues thereafter. But that the one crucial figure who was actually on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, with or without Oswald. It doesn't really matter whether Oswald is on the 6th floor or if he's on the 2nd floor drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola. Even that's been debunked, by the way. He was apparently walking through the 2nd floor. He wasn't drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola at the time. That's a conflation of 2 different anecdotes. There was another guy drinking a bottle of Coke. Anyway, but he's commonly reported to have been drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola at the time. Crucially, that Mac Wallace, who has a long track record of carrying out political favors for LBJ, including murder, but not limited to murder. He was a kind of henchman for LBJ, and there really is hard evidence of that. That Mac Wallace took the lead, and that Mac Wallace really carried out the assassination as such. So, what changes? You know, what are the stakes? I mean, sorry, all 3 of these books are badly flawed. I've already said that Seymour Hersh I basically kind of regard as an idiot. What changes when we compare the world of JFK Assassinology of the 1980s to the world around the year 2000 and the year now in the 2020s and moving forward? Well, I have to tell you, I think it's really quite profound. I think it's really of tremendous political and philosophical significance. What's changed? In the past, people tried to make JFK into a paragon of virtue, and they tried to explain the conspiracy to assassinate him as an attempt to assail or overturn those virtues. So I have heard so-called experts claim, deadpan serious, this is many decades ago, that JFK was trying to achieve equality for Black people, for African Americans, and that these evil people in the military establishment, the CIA and the Secret Service, they were such diehard, true-believing white supremacists. They were so opposed to integration and equality that they therefore contrived this assassination of JFK. Now, there's only one. We could list here a dozen different conspiracy theories following this pattern. The point being in the pattern that JFK is represented as pure and honest and well-intentioned, and that the conspiracy is in opposition to that purity of intention. Now, the theory that Oliver Stone made tremendously popular. So it's actually a funny irony. You have Oliver Stone on the one hand, and today Roger Stone is leading the opposite camp. Actually, Roger Stone's book could be added to this stack. Roger Stone's book is very much the same hypothesis as this one, putting great emphasis on LBJ as the linchpin figure in the decision. Anyway, what Oliver Stone popularized is the fiction, the delusion, that JFK wanted to bring peace to Vietnam. He wanted to end the Vietnam War, and there was a conspiracy to instead expand the Vietnam War to make sure the Vietnam War happened, metastasized, grew out of control. And there can be no doubt that Fletcher Prudy was a crucial part of the construction of this myth. And by the way, Oliver Stone also directly spoke to Howard Hunt. He was in negotiations to pay Howard Hunt a huge amount of money to get Howard Hunt's story officially into the film, and it didn't work out. So both Howard Hunt and Prudy, imperfect. It's not that Stone's work directly gives voice to their view of the assassination, but they certainly were crucial influences. However incoherently that influence came out in the final film. Okay, so again, that whole model of seeing JFK as a paragon of virtue, and then the people who contrived to assassinate him as representing the inverse and opposite evils. So whether one side represents peace, the other side represents war, one side represents equality and liberation for Black people. And although, mysteriously, when you think about it, wasn't it LBJ who passed all the crucial legislation for equality of African Americans, the Civil Rights Act? Wasn't that all under LBJ, not under JFK? Wasn't it LBJ who was committed to all that stuff from his early days, being a school teacher in poverty-stricken, predominantly Hispanic areas in Texas? It's actually LBJ that's all about, and not JFK for some reason when you look at this. So we have an overall shift, both in the assessment of who JFK was and his political significance, and in the reasons for the assassination. A shift away from it being a duel about ideology to being a dirty personal power struggle between LBJ and JFK, and in which we have to recognize that all of the ideals we may now retroactively ascribe to the event, they are quite irrelevant. Now, of all these books, it's only this one, criticize it as I might, The Dark Side of Camelot by Seymour Hersh. It's only this one which asks and answers the question, why were so many people willing to go along with LBJ's plot? So obviously we can list off a huge number of names, the number of people who were implicated and involved and are part of this conspiracy and are part of the cover-up afterwards. But to use just one, J. Edgar Hoover. Now I know people have this simplistic view, like, oh, well, J. Edgar Hoover is evil incarnate, so he's just doing evil stuff all the time. Well, no. J. Edgar Hoover was a man who followed orders his whole life, and he'd followed orders for all kinds of presidents of the United States of America, good and bad. He was a man who followed orders and didn't give orders. And he obviously was personally convinced that JFK was evil enough or dangerous enough that morally the right thing for him to do, for J. Edgar Hoover to do, was to become a party to this assassination plot and to be involved in the cover-up afterwards. Now, again, you may dehumanize J. Edgar Hoover in your imagination, but sort of take a minute to think about him as a human being with its decades-long career, and he knows about all kinds of different crime and all kinds of different corruption. He's a guy who literally collected dossiers on basically every politician in the United States, who was taking bribes from whom, who had sex scandals with whom, this kind of material for blackmail or what have you. But he was a guy who, spent his whole life studying the criminal underworld and very much dealing with the overlap between criminality and electoral politics. So he really understood this stuff. To give an example, J. Edgar Hoover knew exactly how corrupt Nixon was. And there was a significant amount of corruption there. He knew exactly how corrupt LBJ was. But J. Edgar Hoover felt that John Kennedy was worse. That John Kennedy being in that position of power was so bad, was so dangerous, was so terrible that it was worth him risking his own life over. I mean, like, ultimately, Hoover could have gone to jail. Hoover could have been killed in the ensuing controversy or the ensuing assassination. That it was worth taking this risk and taking this step just to replace someone as bad as JFK with someone as bad as LBJ. I mean, no one reads this history and represents LBJ as an angel. So I just want to say there are 2 or 3 different big, profound shifts in how we think about politics, and not just American politics, covered in this 30-minute video. It's very easy for us to think about the period of our own childhood, your childhood, my childhood, as if that were a period of naivete and purity and good intentions in the world, whereas the period of our adulthood is a period of corruption and bad intentions in the world. And that is psychological projection in the strictest sense. It's also incredibly common for people to remember the university professors of their youth as tremendously brilliant and insightful, and to regard the professors who replaced them a generation later as terrible and fools. Well, okay, but you were young and naive when you made that evaluation of these professors. Now you're old and sophisticated. This is the most common thing in the world, for people to complain about the decline in the quality of education, the decline in the quality of their professors, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of psychological projection is very common. I think that there was a kind of terrifying Machiavellian realism to the post-war generation, to the post-war world. And that what we need to reckon with today is the extent to which we are more idealistic, not less. We are more trapped in abstract reasoning. We're more unable to make pragmatic, real-world decisions than the people who, in that generation, had the cynicism to see through the veneer of these categories: communist, capitalist, Democrat, Republican, to not think of the world in terms of pure and impure, or even in terms of right and wrong, but perhaps more pragmatically and more tragically about the difference that we can make, in contrast to the difference that we cannot.